I've learned so much from Andy in the brief time we've known each other. And I read about something recently, and I said there's nobody I'd rather have talk about this than Andy. Besides his great work with place he's worked at for 40 years, he was a college football player at Rutgers, so he's got a little bit of a football background as well. So I read a story in the New York Times early this week, and as I read the story, I said to myself, I got to talk to Andy. He's the perfect person to talk about this. Anyone ever heard of the football player Rashaan Salam? He was a Heisman Trophy winner, played for the Chicago Bears, and recently he took his own life at 42 years of age. And in the story, it said that the Heisman Trophy kind of became a burden in his life. That he didn't ask to get this award. It was bestowed upon him for the greatest college football player. And through the years, he couldn't escape it. Like, an organization would call him up and say, you got to come to this event, but make sure you bring the trophy with you. And as he got older in life, he battled serious depression, anxiety. And right before he died, he actually reached out to a bunch of high school students and tried to make a difference with them, but the pain he felt was too severe and took his life. But Andy, what's your thoughts on this young man and what he must have gone through the years?
Well, I mean, I don't know and can't claim to know all of the factors that might have contributed to his depression and that led to his suicide in the end. I don't know what his childhood was like. One of the things that we need to understand in working in mental health with children and with adults is to know about adverse childhood experiences because they have a tremendous impact on kids as they get older. We have to know about events that might have occurred in his life, losses, traumatic situations, how they might have impacted on him. And in addition to him, years later, becoming the most heralded college football player, winning the greatest award for someone that plays college football, which is the Heisman Trophy. What we don't know for sure is what the impact of constant brain damage from using your head as a battering ram and being hit might have had on him. Now, some years back, not that long ago, there's a great doctor, a pathologist. His name is Dr. Bennett Amalu. And he studied the brain of a football player named Mike Webster, who was a center, an offensive lineman for those who don't follow football. And he was a Hall of Fame player for the Steel Curtain, the Pittsburgh Steelers, who won 4 Super Bowls way back when and a few more years later. And after his career, as great and as beloved as he was, he became destitute, homeless, mentally ill, lived out of a car, lost his teeth, just had all kinds of trouble. And it's a longer story, but to make it short, Dr. Bennett Amalu had the opportunity to study his brain. And when he studied his brain, he discovered something that was very unusual, which he later went on to call CTE, which stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And the long and short of it is, if you get repeated concussions, it affects the makeup of the brain in such a way that it deteriorates your ability to function at a normal level. It can lead to aggression, to depression, to impulse impulsivity, all kinds of difficulties in terms of concentration and memory, and basically you're just not yourself anymore and you don't know what's wrong. And just as tonight people told stories that at one time were kept in the shadows, the problem of concussions in sports, and particularly in football, was swept under the rug by the National Football League for many years. And so one of the concerns in terms of trying to understand what might have led to this young man, who I believe was maybe 40 or 42 years old, was that this may have been, at least in part, if not wholly, a consequence of him having CTE. More and more football players these days are allowing their brains to be studied after their deaths because they understand that they're not being taken care of. They're being used for this multi-billion-dollar industry that doesn't do right by them. They're making some changes, but doesn't do right by them. So what Dr. Bennett Amalu talked about is the importance of getting past what he referred to as consensual validation. That means going against the grain, not going with what everybody else believes, which is what he had to do. He was discredited by the National Football League for many years, and finally the truth came forward, and now they're dealing with this. But this young man had a brain disease. There's a good chance that he had a brain disease, and that was a major contributor to his ultimate demise by his own hand.
Absolutely. Andy, another athlete that comes to mind is Junior Seau. I mean, think about Junior Seau. Played middle linebacker, the most vicious position in football. You're flying around the field. 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, and 20 years in the NFL. So that's 28 straight years of violent collisions. And he was an all-out player, one of the great linebackers of all time. But he played all out, flew all over the field, great player. But 28 straight years of violent contact, and within a couple of years after he retired, he was constantly flew into rages, depression, anxiety, and he took his life a few years after his career.
Yeah, I think what's important to understand here, if you watch, now we're into the playoffs, so even people who don't watch all the time maybe get kind of forced to sit down and watch the Super Bowl, and every once in a while you'll see a flag. That's when the referee throws this little yellow handkerchief, and it's a penalty. And if you see a flagrant situation where somebody flies through the air like a projectile into the head of another player, then that's cause for immediate ejection. But what you don't see and what they don't call is up on the line where all the biggest guys, the 3 and 350-pound players, and then the halfbacks that run into the lines, they're battering their heads on almost every play. Okay, so there's a lot going on that doesn't get pointed out that leads to what Howie's talking about here with a player like Junior Seau. However, for those of you who have young people in your families that play football, if you saw the cover story in Newsday a few weeks ago, there was a big story about how much money they're spending on football helmets now in the high schools in order to protect kids. What I think is important to know is that it doesn't matter how good the helmet is. Yes, better helmets, more padding, more protection. What causes concussions is the brain moving around inside the skull. So you'd have to have a helmet that was about 25 inches wide with padding before it wouldn't have an impact on you. So when someone uses their head as a battering ram or gets hit, or even gets hit somewhere else, but it moves their head around, the brain moves around. That's what causes a concussion. So the helmet might protect you from getting a fracture, but not from a concussion. So it's important to know that if you hear that come up in conversation, or if you know somebody who's playing, just be aware of it.
Andrew, thank you, Andy Malakoff, thank you so much for sharing. All right,